As I said, I've always liked this story. I've reacted to it positively for several reasons. One, because it's short, and two, because in its shortness and its structure, Mark is, through Jesus, is inviting us to look and observe the world as it in fact exists. Basically, Mark sets it up this way. There are those, and there will always be those, who seek the greatest respect, the best seats, and the places of honor, and not just anywhere, but in public spaces, in the marketplace, in the churches, in the cathedrals, in the synagogues, at banquets, at political conventions. Having set it up, Jesus invites us to sit down using this little short story between the rich man and the poor widow and observe the two people who are offering gifts. So what do we see in this setup? We see people putting money into the temple treasury. We see a rich man and a widow putting money into the treasury. Jesus comments on the quantity of the offering between the rich man and the widow. The rich man puts in large sums, while the widow puts in a penny. The rich man is not stretched financially by his offering, but the opposite is true of the widow. Jesus then remarks on the nature of quantity. Quantity is more truly dependent on the cost to the giver. 2 copper coins giving out of poverty can exceed large sums given out of wealth. In comparing the nature of giving, Jesus seems to suggest that something happens to us. Something also transpires between the giver and the recipient, as well as between the giver and God, when significant cost is at stake for the giver. Again, 2 copper coins given out of poverty can exceed large sums given out of wealth. But underneath that, we see that this short story tells us about God's attentiveness to the material needs of humanity. We see this in the face of economic needs. A penny becomes more costly than large sums. But there is another point and another insight that Jesus points to. It's all very, not even nuanced, not subtle, but nuanced, and rides very quickly across in this story. Jesus points to the collection trunks in the temple and toward the office of treasury itself. This scene that Jesus sets up is not about who's giving, but it's about watching those who create systems of giving. Jesus directs our vision beyond the collection plate to the treasury's office, where the scales hang, where the plans are hatched, where books are balanced, and where the bottom line can receive more attention than the cries of the people. It's not about giving, but as evident of the scribe. Or a harsh rebuke of the temple system and of the authorities themselves, who are exploiting people under the guise of religious commitment. Jesus condemns the scribes for devouring widows' households, for preying on the poor by urging them to give their scarce resources to the temple, thus leaving themselves destitute of even the usual subsistence livelihood. He was making a point about institutional economic injustice, and it receives Jesus's harshest rebuke. So that's the outline of the story. But I'm going to ask the same question I asked you 2 weeks ago when we were reading another parable that was also short, and you also remember I liked it, but that said, what does that have to do with us today in 2021 and our current context? So if you thought that one way of only looking at this is looking and examining the economic life of first century Palestine, I'm suggesting we're called to reflect on our own economic times. And as we begin to do that, we become uneasy and uncomfortable. Whether it is in the Star or in the Globe and Mail, reading about economic systems cares for today's widows, those who are most economically vulnerable, is uncomfortable. It is in fact disquieting. It is in fact, I want to push and stretch to further to say that in the midst of the pandemic, we have become the widows. We are lost. What we have known is no longer the way it was when we knew it. So much of what we know, believed, and thought and acted on, it's like the rug has been pulled from under us. We have now entered a journey, and we must find our way to the other side. Scripture says there is light at the end of the tunnel, but we are in the middle of the tunnel. And in that sense, we have become like the widows, vulnerable. Pope Francis has spoken of this reality when he said in a statement, and I want to read a little section of it, we have forgotten. First of all, we don't even recognize we're all now widows. But he says, we have forgotten and are still forgetting that over and above business, logic, and the parameters of the market is the human being. For so long, what we've been used to is the decentered human being, removed from the center and pushed to the margins through all of our isms and structures of injustice. And he says, and that something in men and women, in as much as they are human beings, by virtue of their profound dignity, the essence of us, we are offered the possibility of living a dignified life and of actively participating in the common good. We must return, he says, to the centrality of the human being, to a more ethical vision of activities and of human relationships without the fear of losing something, which is Jesus's condemnation of the structure of the temple. Being the widow, you give all you have, even if it means you starve to death. But the ideology says you give. There's something wrong with that, Jesus says. It's interesting to note that the pandemic has impacted on this economic reality as well. It has produced a sense in many of us, again, of the worth of human dignity. And it is the human person that is at the center of life itself. We see around us, however, as this sense of the dignity of human being is beginning to emerge within larger and larger people, we see around us the depression, the loneliness, the alienation, as our structures of human relationships have been altered, in some cases destroyed, and many are left hanging without faith or hope. We've been forced as a church to worship differently, to find new ways to relate, a new way through our symbols and worship to express the invitation of Jesus for all of us to be one. It has been difficult. We are in that in-between state where we are being led, sometimes kicking and screaming, into a new way of being, a new reality, a new way of understanding the centrality of human life. And it has not been easy, and it will continue to demand our total participation. And we will still cry and resist, but we're being pulled as we walk through this liminal state of in between what we've left and what is now emerging. We've watched people die. We've had many deaths in this parish, often died alone. We've not been able to have the closure the way we would like to and we're used to. Therefore, our world has been disrupted and turned upside down and around. How many times have preachers preached that that's what the parables do, as Jesus told many a story about the human condition of his time, that the moral of those stories was to turn the world upside down and around. Well, we are experiencing that parable. We are that parable, the parable of the pandemic, I will call it. So the parables there are not little interesting stories that we read and we think they're cute, they're nice, or we can create some pietistic interpretations, but we are a parable. And the parable we're in, i.e. the pandemic, mirrors our own struggles and the reality of today. The question becomes, how do we, in the midst of this in-between state, in the midst of this tragedy, in the midst of new things that are emerging that are helpful and good, how do we respond to the miracles that occur in our own day despite all the tragedy around us? So this treasury that we mentioned in this morning's story, we are creating a new treasury. And this treasury is defined by hospitality. We've discovered during this live parable we're in, injustices in all its guises, be it economic, social, racial, sexual. It's been a pressure point for us. It's no longer theoretical, as we used to comment on the parables. It impacts all of us. It is our life. We are a living parable. So here's what we offer to the widows ourselves as we move through these times and spaces. We offer what I'm calling hospitality, defined this way by Henry Nouwen. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. It is not to bring men and women over to our particular side or ideology, but to offer freedom not disturbed by dividing lines. That's a tough act for us. It is not to lead our neighbor into a corner where there are no alternatives left, but to open a wide spectrum of options for choice and commitment. That's what we are invited into. The paradox of this new treasury is that it wants to create an emptiness, not a fearful emptiness, but a friendly emptiness where strangers can enter and discover themselves as created free. It's not a subtle invitation to adopt the lifestyle of the host, but the gift of a chance for the guest to find his own. That's our journey. And it's dragging us, kicking and screaming. But that's the light on the other side of the tunnel. I want to end this with a poem entitled When the Storm Passes by Alexis Valdés, who's a poet and musician of Cuban descent who lives in Miami. He wrote this poem that I'm going to read to you in 2:20 after he began to watch on film all the various consequences of the pandemic around the world, particularly in Western Europe and Italy in particular. And his poem so impressed Pope Francis so much that not only did he call him in Miami to talk to him about it last year, but he also included it in his own recent book, which is called Let Us Dream, which is a reflection on the challenges of our world today. The same injustice that we read about this morning, and it was only just one of them, is the same injustices and challenges of faith and hope that are given to us today. And here is the poem. When the storm passes, we've reached the other side, just beginning to live into what is emerging in this period, when the storm passes and the roads are tamed, and we are the survivors of a collective shipwreck. With a weeping heart and a blessed destiny, we will feel happy just for being alive. And we will hug the first stranger and praise the luck of not having lost a friend. And then we'll remember everything we lost, and all at once we will learn all we had not learned before. That's part of the light on the other side. We will no longer be envious because we have all suffered. We will no longer be lazy, and we will be more compassionate. What belongs to all will be worth more than that never achieved. We will be more generous and much more committed. We will understand how fragile it means to be alive. We will sweat empathy for who is and who has left. We will miss the old man asking for $1 in the market. We didn't know his name, although he was next to us. And perhaps the poor old man was your God in disguise. You never asked for his name because you were always in a hurry. And everything will be a miracle, and everything will be legacy, and life will be respected, the life we have won. When the storm passes, I ask God, full of sadness, to return us to be better as he had dreamed we would be. Amen.